So there I was, sitting with a strong cup of coffee on a rainy morning, scrolling through the wires, and a single line stopped me cold. President Donald Trump will travel to China from March 31st to April 2nd. 3 days. The Forbidden City, Xi Jinping. The first visit by an American president to Beijing in nearly a decade. And the thought that crossed my mind was this. This is not a diplomatic courtesy call. This is a negotiation between two wounded giants, both of them carrying debts they haven't fully acknowledged yet, circling each other across a table piled high with rare earth minerals, semiconductor patents, aircraft carrier deployments, and the ghost of a tariff war that nearly tore the global trading system in half. Let me tell you what this summit was really about. Because the press conferences, the firm handshakes, the carefully worded communiqués, all of that was the theatrical layer, the performance for domestic audiences on both sides of the Pacific. What happened underneath was something far older, far more structurally significant, and honestly, far more interesting than anything that appeared in the official readouts. We need to go back, not just to 2017, when Trump first made his famous pilgrimage to the Forbidden City and was treated to a private tea ceremony inside its ancient walls, an honor no sitting American president had ever received, but much further. We need to go back to the logic of why these two civilizations keep colliding, keep trying to outmaneuver each other, keep arriving at these stage summits where both leaders emerge claiming victory and both go home knowing the real competition hasn't even entered its decisive phase. Now, here is the detail that nobody is talking about, but that changes the entire frame of this story. The US Supreme Court, just weeks before the Beijing trip was confirmed, struck down Trump's sweeping tariffs. The tariffs he had used as his primary weapon of economic pressure, not just against China but against virtually every major trading partner, were ruled unconstitutional. And just like that, Trump walked into Beijing with his most intimidating card yanked out of his hand by his own judicial system. The man who loves leverage more than any other commodity on earth arrived at the negotiating table with significantly less of it than he had planned to bring. Think about what that means in practice. The entire architecture of Trump's second-term foreign policy was built on the threat of economic coercion. You cooperate or you face the tariff wall. That wall, for the moment, was gone. What remained were bluster, brand, and the residual weight of American military power, which, as we will see, was itself being stretched thin in ways that Beijing's strategic planners had noticed very carefully. Let's slow down because the history here is worth understanding. It explains everything that followed. When Richard Nixon flew to Beijing in 1972, he crossed what had been an ideological chasm so deep that merely proposing the trip had seemed, to much of Washington's establishment, like strategic heresy. Nixon shook hands with Mao Zedong. He announced to the world that the bipolar Cold War logic, in which every nation was either in the American column or the Soviet column, was over. A third great power had been acknowledged. What nobody standing on the Great Wall in 1972 could have predicted was that the entity Nixon legitimized would, 50-odd years later, present itself not merely as a regional power to be balanced against Moscow, but as a genuine challenger to the entire system of economic organization that America had built after the Second World War. That China would one day control the dominant share of global rare earth processing. That it would manufacture more cars than any other country on earth. That its Belt and Road Initiative, its 21st century reimagining of the ancient Silk Road, would have laid infrastructure across more than 140 countries. The Silk Road. Let's pause on that because it keeps appearing in this story, not as metaphor but as blueprint. The original Silk Road was never simply a trade route, it was a nervous system. It connected the silk workshops of Chang'an to the spice markets of Samarkand, to the glass blowers of Alexandria, to the wool traders of Venice. It moved commodities, yes, but it also moved ideas, faiths, armies, and the accumulated knowledge of civilizations. Whoever sat astride its key nodes held enormous structural power. The great Abbasid Caliphate understood this. The Mongol Yuan dynasty understood this. And now, in the 21st century, Beijing was attempting something extraordinarily ambitious: rebuilding that nervous system under Chinese sponsorship, from the ports of Sri Lanka to the railways of Central Asia to the fiber optic cables running under the Indian Ocean. Now, we are getting to the most surprising part of this story, because the United States did not simply watch this unfold and do nothing. Starting in 2018, the tariffs went up, first on steel, then on aluminum, then on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese manufactured goods. Beijing retaliated. American soybean farmers in Iowa and Michigan felt the pain almost immediately. The global supply chains that had been built over decades on the assumption of frictionless US-China trade began to seize and crack. But here was the fundamental contradiction the tariff strategy never resolved. American corporations, over 30 years of integration, had become so deeply embedded in Chinese manufacturing ecosystems that disentangling them was not like pulling a plug. It was more like trying to surgically separate two organisms that had grown around each other. Apple built its supply chain in China not because of ideology, but because of capability. The precision manufacturing, the clustering of suppliers, the trained workforce, these could not simply be relocated to Ohio by executive order. The tariffs hurt both sides, but they hurt the American consumer in ways that showed up immediately at the cash register. Through the Biden years, the tariff structure largely remained in place. Then came Trump's return, with escalation to levels that economists described as potentially catastrophic for global trade. Both sides knew the most extreme numbers would not be fully implemented. They were negotiating positions, but they created an atmosphere of permanent crisis that neither economy could comfortably sustain. And the detail nobody talks about, but that decides the game, is this. By October 2025, both sides were exhausted. The summit in Busan, South Korea, on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, was the moment the truce was formalized. Trump and Xi agreed to step back from the most extreme measures. Tariffs came below 50% for a year. Trump called China the biggest partner of the US. Xi's foreign ministry described the atmosphere as moving toward a landmark year. The language was warm. The underlying structural competition had not moved an inch. Which brings us to March 31st, 2026, and a presidential motorcade rolling through the streets of Beijing. Let's be honest about what Trump wanted from this trip, because it matters enormously for understanding what kind of deal was possible. Trump operates with a very specific theory of how international relations work. It is essentially a real estate developer's theory. Every interaction is a transaction. Every transaction has a price. Every price can be negotiated if you know what the other side needs badly enough. And what Trump needed in the spring of 2026 was a headline, something he could hold up and say, "Look what I did. No other president could have delivered this." The problem was that the results available were, by any realistic assessment, fairly modest. The Supreme Court had already taken his tariff leverage away. The United States was simultaneously running a costly military operation against Iran, we will get to that in a moment, which was consuming political capital and defense resources. And China, for all its own considerable economic headaches, held several cards that Trump very much needed: rare earth minerals, market access for American agricultural exports, cooperation on fentanyl precursor chemicals, and the implicit threat of further restrictions on semiconductor supply chains that American technology companies could not do without. This is where it gets structurally fascinating. There is a concept in Chinese strategic thinking, drawn from the classical game of weiqi, what the West calls Go, that describes a situation where you do not try to win the decisive battle directly, but instead surround the decisive space, accumulate positional advantages, and allow the opponent's position to become untenable over time. The weiqi player does not look at the board the way a chess player looks at a board. There is no single decisive capture, no checkmate moment. There is only the gradual, patient construction of an unassailable positional advantage. And as Trump's motorcade drove through Beijing, Beijing had been playing weiqi for decades, while Washington had been playing chess. What Beijing wanted from this summit was not a dramatic public concession. Dramatic public concessions embarrass the conceding party and create domestic political problems. What Beijing wanted was the slow, incremental erosion of the structures that sustained American primacy, a softening of the language around Taiwan, a reduction in arms sales to Taipei, a tacit acknowledgement that the United States was prepared to accept a more managed relationship in the Taiwan Strait. Nothing written down, nothing that could be held up as a betrayal, just a gradual repositioning of the rhetorical furniture. And there was something very significant sitting in the background that the mainstream commentary largely failed to connect to the summit, what had been happening in the Persian Gulf since late February. Here is the real breaking point of this entire story. On the 28th of February, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military operation against Iran under the name Epic Fury. The operation targeted military installations, nuclear infrastructure, and, in its most consequential strike, the leadership compound where Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was present. Khamenei did not survive the operation. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, assumed the mantle of supreme leadership. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps responded within hours, hitting American installations across the broader Middle East, and most consequentially for the global economy, declaring the Strait of Hormuz closed to shipping from the United States, Israel, and their Western allies. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow ribbon of water between Iran and Oman, barely 21 miles across at its tightest point. Through it, on any given day before the crisis, flowed roughly 20% of the world's crude oil and a substantial share of its liquefied natural gas. Within days of the closure declaration, tanker traffic had dropped to near zero. Oil prices screamed upward past $100 a barrel and kept going. Analysts were projecting 140 if the closure held for another month. And here is where the Beijing summit and the Hormuz crisis collapsed into the same story, because they were always the same story. China receives a massive share of its oil imports through the Strait of Hormuz. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, are China's primary energy suppliers. Every day the strait remained closed was another day the Chinese manufacturing machine was burning through strategic reserves rather than freshly imported crude. The economic pressure on Beijing from the Hormuz closure was, in some ways, more acute than anything Trump's tariffs had generated because it was physical rather than financial. You can hedge financial pressures. You cannot conjure oil that isn't arriving. But here is the detail that nobody in the Western financial press was connecting properly. A senior Iranian official told CNN that Tehran was considering allowing a limited number of oil tankers through the strait, but only if the cargo was priced and settled in Chinese yuan, not in US dollars. Read that again, slowly. The condition for reopening one of the most critical energy arteries on Earth was the abandonment of the petrodollar for those transactions. The system born from the Nixon shock of 1971, formalized in the secret 1974 arrangement with Saudi Arabia, under which Gulf oil would be priced in dollars, generating permanent demand for US Treasury bonds and permanently underwriting American financial hegemony, that system in this single sentence had just received what may be remembered as its most significant structural challenge in 52 years, because the yuan condition wasn't really about yuan. It was about establishing a precedent. It was about demonstrating in real time, with real barrels of oil moving through a real strait, that the dollar's monopoly on energy pricing was breakable, that a country under sufficient pressure could force a transaction to settle in a different currency and the world would keep turning. This was the context in which Donald Trump flew to Beijing. Let's be precise about the rare earth dimension, because it kept lurking underneath every public statement and every background briefing during this period. China processes somewhere around 85 to 90% of the world's rare earth elements. These are not exotic laboratory curiosities. Neodymium goes into the magnets in every electric motor. Dysprosium makes those magnets functional at high temperatures. The entire architecture of the green energy transition, the entire project of building a 21st century industrial economy that runs on something other than hydrocarbons, depends on a supply chain that runs through Chinese processing facilities. In late 2025, Beijing had tightened restrictions on rare earth exports, not completely, not dramatically, just enough to send a signal. just enough to remind every semiconductor manufacturer, every defense contractor, every electric vehicle company in the United States that there was a pressure point and that Beijing's finger was resting gently near it. The weiqi players move, not an attack, a repositioning, a demonstration of the board's topology. Trump, who understood leverage even when it was being applied to him, understood what Beijing was communicating, and reporting in the days before the summit painted a revealing picture of American preparation. No final list of officials traveling, no agreed agenda, a stark contrast between the meticulous advance work of Chinese protocol officers and the characteristic last-minute improvisation of the Trump White House. The Chinese side had been preparing for this summit for months. The American side, distracted by Iran and Venezuela and the Supreme Court ruling and midterm election positioning, had been preparing for perhaps weeks. This asymmetry was not accidental. It was structural. It reflected the different time horizons of the two systems. Beijing operates on 5-year plans, 10-year plans, 100-year national rejuvenation narratives. The Chinese Communist Party's institutional memory runs from the humiliations of the Opium War era through the Long March through Deng Xiaoping's reforms to Xi Jinping's current project of comprehensive national power. Every interaction with foreign powers is processed through that very long historical lens. Washington operates on 2-year election cycles, 4-year presidential terms, and the daily temperature of social media sentiment. The mismatch between these time horizons was visible in the summit preparation, and it would be visible in whatever emerged from it. But here is something that almost everyone missed, and it's the most surprising part of this story. Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, struck what observers described as a surprisingly upbeat tone at his press conference before the summit. He spoke of hopes that 2026 would be a landmark year for US-China relations. He urged both sides to foster a suitable atmosphere, manage existing differences, and eliminate unnecessary distractions. Now, Wang Yi is not given to effusive optimism as a rhetorical style. He is precise, careful, and almost always calibrated to the millimeter. When Wang Yi sounds upbeat, it is because Beijing has calculated that an upbeat tone serves Beijing's interests in that specific moment. And Beijing's interest was to keep Trump in a collaborative frame of mind long enough for the summit to produce optics, handshakes, signed agreements on agricultural purchases and energy imports, that Trump could present to his domestic base as a win, while changing as little as possible about the structural competition for technological leadership, military positioning in the Indo-Pacific, and the long-term question of Taiwan's status. Taiwan, the word that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere in the pre-summit commentary. Xi had told Trump on a February phone call that Taiwan was the most important issue in China-US relations. That is not a diplomatic pleasantry. That is a strategic declaration. Beijing's demand on Taiwan was not new in content. It has been China's position since 1949, but its elevation to the top of the summit agenda reflected a calculation that the current moment offered unusual leverage. The Trump administration had withheld a $13 billion weapons package to Taiwan in the weeks before the summit. The stated rationale was procedural, and the administration signaled the sale would proceed after Trump returned from Beijing, but the timing was significant. The message to Beijing was, "We are willing to modulate the pace and visibility of our arms relationship with Taiwan in the context of managing the broader relationship with you." That was not a concession. But it was an invitation to explore what a more managed Taiwan relationship might look like in practice. Now, the detail nobody talks about, but that decides the game. Xi Jinping was operating with his own set of domestic pressures that Western commentary consistently underestimated. China's economy in early 2026 was not the thundering engine of growth it had been in the previous decade. Property sector stress, a demographic slowdown, youth unemployment at uncomfortable levels, a manufacturing sector producing extraordinary quantities of electric vehicles and solar panels, but struggling to find markets willing to absorb them at viable prices. These were real structural challenges. The extraordinary confidence of Chinese foreign policy in the Xi era rested ultimately on a domestic economic foundation that was not quite as solid as the outward performance suggested. Xi needed the summit to succeed because a successful summit with America's president was evidence for the domestic audience that China's rise was proceeding on acceptable terms. Both leaders needed the summit to succeed. Both were bringing loaded guns to the table, as one analyst put it, but neither wanted to fire them. And in the background of all this, something was happening to the global monetary system that neither the summit communiques nor the press conferences would acknowledge directly. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves had fallen from 71% at the turn of the millennium to somewhere around 58.5% by early 2026. That sounds like a modest decline until you notice the pace of change. The last 5 years had seen an acceleration in that trend rather than a stabilization. Central banks around the world, not just in Russia or China, but in the Gulf states, in Southeast Asia, in parts of Latin America, had been quietly accumulating gold at rates not seen in decades. In 2025 alone, central banks purchased over 1,100 tons of gold, the third consecutive year above that threshold. Gold, which cannot be frozen in a sanctions action the way dollar-denominated assets can be frozen, as Russia's central bank reserves famously were in 2022. Gold, which sits outside the SWIFT system, outside the correspondent banking network, outside the architecture of dollar supremacy. And on October 31st, 2025, a date that received almost no coverage in Western financial media, but that deserves to be remembered, the BRICS bloc launched a pilot program for something called the Unit, a gold-backed settlement instrument for wholesale trade designed to operate outside the dollar system for specific categories of transactions. Not a replacement for the dollar overnight, not even close, but a proof of concept, a demonstration that an architecture for dollar alternative settlement was technically feasible and politically viable among the countries that had chosen to participate. The Iran condition on Hormuz transit, pay in yuan, fit into this broader picture with disturbing coherence. It was not a single rogue maneuver by a country under military pressure. It was a pressure test of the petrodollar system at a moment when the system was already showing structural fatigue. Here is the real breaking point, and it's one that the Beijing summit only partially addressed. The architecture of American power in the post-World War II era rested on three interconnected pillars: military projection, the ability to deploy force anywhere on Earth faster and more lethally than any rival; economic centrality, the dollar as the global reserve currency, Wall Street as the arbiter of sovereign creditworthiness; and technological leadership, American companies at the frontier of every transformative technology, from semiconductors to software to biotechnology. All three pillars were under simultaneous pressure in a way they had not been since perhaps the early 1970s. The military was stretched across multiple theaters. The economic centrality was eroding slowly but measurably, and the technological leadership was being contested most directly by China, which had made the semiconductor supply chain the central battleground of its industrial strategy. The Trump-Xi summit in Beijing could not resolve any of these structural tensions. What it could do was establish a temporary framework of managed competition, rules of engagement under which the two powers competed vigorously in some domains while cooperating minimally in others, and above all, avoided the kind of catastrophic miscalculation that could tip managed rivalry into actual confrontation. Think of Halford Mackinder, the British geographer who in 1904 articulated his famous heartland theory: whoever controlled the vast continental interior of Eurasia controlled the pivot of world power. What Mackinder could not have foreseen was the emergence of a power attempting to be both maritime and heartland simultaneously, projecting naval power through port investments while anchoring its position in the Eurasian interior through rail connections and pipeline infrastructure that bypassed the sea lanes where American power remained unchallenged. China was trying to break Mackinder's binary, and the Beijing summit, in its deepest logic, was a moment where the legacy maritime superpower and the aspiring heartland and sea power attempted to establish the terms under which they would coexist. The Forbidden City, which Trump entered for his summit meetings, was built by the Yongle Emperor of the Ming Dynasty at the beginning of the 15th century. It was designed to project absolute imperial authority, to make every visitor feel the weight of centuries of civilization pressing down upon them. Its gates were calibrated to produce a specific psychological effect. You entered through one courtyard, then another, each one larger and more imposing than the last, until you arrived at the Hall of Supreme Harmony feeling very small indeed. Architecture as geopolitical messaging, refined over 600 years of practice. The Forbidden City knew how to receive powerful guests and send them home with the impression that they had achieved something significant, while the longer game continued on its own trajectory, unaffected by the emotional temperature of any particular visit. And here is the question that stays with me, the one I kept turning over after reading every wire dispatch and every analytical piece from those 3 days in Beijing, in a world where the structures that sustained American hegemony are under simultaneous pressure, where the petrodollar is being tested at its weakest points, where Eurasian integration is proceeding regardless of what any one summit decides, where rare earth supplies are increasingly a geopolitical instrument rather than a commercial market. In that world, what does a successful summit actually look like? Is it a managed descent, a graceful adjustment of American ambitions to match American capabilities in a multipolar world? Or is it a continuation of the performance, the insistence that nothing fundamental has changed, the kicking of structural contradictions down the road for the next administration, the next summit, the next crisis? Because here is what the history of declining hegemonies consistently shows. The recognition that the system needs fundamental adjustment almost always comes later than it should, and the adjustment almost always costs more than it would have if it had come earlier. The great powers do not fall because they lose a single decisive confrontation. They fall because the accumulated costs of maintaining an architecture built for an earlier era exceed the returns that architecture generates, and the political system cannot find a way to acknowledge that arithmetic in time. Trump went to Beijing. He sat with Xi. They talked about soybeans and semiconductors and Taiwan and rare earths and what they each needed to be able to say they had won. Somewhere in the background, the Hormuz crisis ground on, and oil stayed above $100, and central banks kept buying gold, and Iranian officials kept floating the idea that some tankers might pass if the payment was in yuan. The bill for Beijing, the real bill, is not the one that appeared in any communiqué. It is the bill that accumulates quietly in reserve share statistics and gold vault receipts and yuan-denominated settlement volumes until one day it is presented all at once. Who pays it? That is the question that keeps me up at night, and that is the question we will be answering together in this very specific and very consequential moment, where the map of the world is being redrawn not with armies and declarations, but with pipelines and payment systems, and the patient, unhurried logic of the long game. Stay with me, because we are only at the beginning of this story.